Day 54. Nancy Guthrie has not been found, and the man leading the search for her just received a vote of no confidence from his own department. 241 deputies voted against him. 0 voted in his favor. That is where this investigation stands today. The Pima County Board of Supervisors has already moved. They voted to require Sheriff Chris Nanos to submit a sworn report explaining his conduct. If he fails to comply, they can remove him from office. The hearing is scheduled for April 7th, 2 weeks from now. Think about that for a moment. The person responsible for finding an 84-year-old woman, a woman who was taken from her home in the middle of the night, may not be in that job by the end of the month. This video is not going to ask who abducted Nancy Guthrie. Every channel has asked that question. We are asking something different today. The question is this: did decisions made inside this investigation, not at the crime scene, but in the rooms where investigators choose how to handle evidence, how to communicate with federal agencies, how to speak to the public, did those decisions affect why, after 54 days, she still has not been found? We are going to walk through the first serious mistake made within 24 hours of Nancy's disappearance. We are going to look at where the critical DNA evidence is sitting right now, and why the FBI wanted it somewhere else entirely. We are going to examine a theory that most coverage has not fully addressed, that someone may have already been inside Nancy's home when the masked suspect appeared at her front door. And we are going to talk about January 11th, 3 weeks before Nancy disappeared, a date the FBI has asked neighbors about, a date Nancy's own family specifically flagged in a public statement, and a date that authorities have never explained. If you have any information about Nancy Guthrie, anything at all, the FBI tip line is open right now. The number is 1-800-CALL-FBI. That number will appear again at the end of this video. If you were in the Catalina Foothills area on or around January 11th, check your security footage. That date matters to this investigation. Crime Doc Network covers every meaningful development in active cases. Subscribe and turn on notifications. When something breaks in this case, you will know before anyone else. Here is what you need to understand before we go further. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, co-host of NBC's Today Show. She lives alone in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood outside Tucson, Arizona. She depends on daily medication. She has no known cognitive impairments. The evening of January 31st, Nancy spent time with family. She took an Uber home that night. FBI agents later obtained footage from inside the vehicle. According to investigative reporter Dave Mack, who spoke with sources close to the case, investigators found nothing notable, nothing in her demeanor, nothing in what she said. Sometime in the early hours of February 1st, a suspect came to her front door. Bloodstains were discovered at the entrance to her home. Forensic DNA testing confirmed the blood belonged to Nancy. At noon on February 1st, Nancy did not appear for a scheduled virtual church service with a friend. That friend raised the alarm. Law enforcement was called. What investigators found at that residence made one thing clear immediately. Nancy did not leave on her own. The Pima County Sheriff's Department treated the home as a crime scene and brought in homicide detectives alongside search personnel. The FBI joined the investigation shortly after, citing the suspicious circumstances and Nancy's classification as a vulnerable adult due to her age and medical needs. Multiple ransom notes were recovered demanding payment in cryptocurrency. 2 separate deadlines had passed by February 9th. No confirmed communication between the family and any credible party has been made public. On February 10th, FBI Director Kash Patel released doorbell camera footage showing a masked suspect approaching Nancy's home on the morning she disappeared. The suspect is described as male, 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10, average build, with a black mustache. He carried a 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack, a model sold through Walmart. He had a firearm in a holster that the sheriff publicly described as having some pretty unique characteristics. The Guthrie family has posted a $1 million reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery. The FBI has offered an additional $100,000. The total reward currently stands at $1.1 million. As of today, no suspect has been publicly named. No arrests have been made. That is the foundation. Now here is what most people are not talking about and why it changes the shape of this entire case. The first serious mistake happened on February 2nd, one day after Nancy was reported missing. One day after investigators arrived at her home and began processing what was clearly a crime scene. Sheriff Chris Nanos stood in front of cameras and told the country that Nancy Guthrie had been taken from her bed. He said it with certainty. It was picked up immediately. Every major outlet reported it. 24 hours later, he walked it back. There was no evidence to support that claim. There had never been any evidence to support it. Now consider what that means in practice. In the first 48 hours of a missing persons investigation, the window that former law enforcement consistently describe as the most critical, the lead agency publicly committed to a version of events it could not verify. Tips came in shaped around that detail. Neighbors searched their memories for something matching that detail. The information environment around this case was colored by a fact that was not a fact. Nanos has defended his handling of the case. He told NBC News that sometimes things take time, that he wants answers as fast as anyone. But a retraction on day 2 is not a matter of timing. It is a matter of what gets said before the evidence is ready to support it. That was not the only problem with the evidence. When Nancy disappeared, investigators initially believed the doorbell camera at her home had been disconnected. Nanos publicly stated that Nancy did not have a subscription that would save video footage, and that recovering any data would be extremely difficult. For 10 days, that is where things stood. Then the FBI recovered the footage anyway. Federal agents pulled the video from what Director Kash Patel described as back-end systems. The technical details of how that was accomplished have not been fully explained publicly. Experts who spoke to NBC News noted that in some cases, data can be retrieved from the infrastructure supporting cloud-based camera systems, even after local storage has been wiped or disabled. 10 days passed between Nancy's disappearance and the release of that footage. 10 days during which investigators did not have a visual record of who came to her door. 10 days during which the investigation operated without what would become its most significant piece of publicly available evidence. The footage, when it finally came out, showed the suspect methodically attempting to disable the camera. He first tried to knock it loose. When that did not work, he covered the lens with foliage from a potted plant on her porch. He had a plan for the camera. He had thought about the camera before he got there. On February 10th, FBI Director Patel posted 4 black and white images from that footage directly to his personal account on X. He described the suspect. He released details about the firearm, the holster, the backpack. He confirmed the FBI had recovered the video from back-end systems. Local and federal investigators on the ground in Arizona were surprised. A source familiar with the investigation told CNN that the team had hoped to keep one specific detail confidential. The masked person had appeared at Nancy's door on more than one occasion. Not just the morning she disappeared. Another night as well. Investigators wanted to control when and how that information became public. Patel's post made that decision for them. This is not a minor coordination disagreement. When an investigation is managing the release of information about a suspect's behavior, the sequencing of what becomes public can directly affect what leads come in and when. That decision was made unilaterally, not by the agency running the investigation on the ground, but by the director of the federal agency assisting it. The friction between those two agencies had already begun to show. It would become much more visible within days, because the next conflict was not about a social media post. It was about where the physical evidence was going to be analyzed, and who was going to control access to it. Reuters reported that the FBI wanted to transfer key evidence, including the glove recovered near Nancy's home and DNA samples collected at the scene, to the Bureau's laboratory at Quantico, Virginia. Quantico is the FBI's primary forensic facility. It is where the Bureau processes evidence in its highest priority cases. Nanos refused. The Pima County Sheriff's Department insisted that all evidence be submitted to a single private laboratory in Florida, DNA Labs International. Nanos said the reasoning was consistency, keeping evidence consolidated in one place, rather than splitting it across multiple facilities. He told a local news station that claims he was blocking the FBI were not true. The FBI said nothing publicly in response. What is documented is this: the DNA evidence did not go to Quantico. It went to Florida. And within weeks, Nanos himself acknowledged on NBC Nightly News that the analysis at that lab was facing complications, from what he described as mixed DNA, multiple genetic profiles present in the same sample, making the separation and identification process significantly more complex. He gave no timeline for when results might be available. Former FBI Supervisory Special Agent Lance Leasing, speaking to CBS News, said the extended timeline pointed to a lack of meaningful leads. He added that as a case stretches past its first weeks, it becomes much harder to keep the investigation current and to generate new information. A retired FBI supervisory special agent who appeared on Fox News put it more directly. He said investigators in cases like this do not wait for standard mail delivery schedules when it comes to DNA. Every day of delay is a day the investigation does not have what it may need to move forward. The glove itself told its own story, and not the one investigators were hoping for. FBI agents found a glove approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home. It appeared to match the gloves worn by the suspect in the doorbell camera footage. The evidence response team collected it. DNA was extracted. The DNA did not match any profile in CODIS, the FBI's national database holding more than 19 million offender records. It did not match DNA found at Nancy's home either. Investigators traced it anyway. The DNA on the glove belonged to an employee at a local restaurant near the Catalina Foothills neighborhood. That person, the Pima County Sheriff publicly stated, is not considered part of this investigation. Dead end. The sheriff noted that other DNA evidence from the scene was still being analyzed. What that evidence is, and what it may show, has not been disclosed. Here is what that leaves us with. 54 days in, no DNA match, no arrest. The primary forensic evidence is sitting at a private lab in Florida, rather than at the bureau that handles cases of this priority level. And the lead agency and the federal agency assisting it disagree on the record about where that evidence should be. But that conflict, as significant as it is not the thing that changes the shape of this case most fundamentally. That would be the door, specifically, the security gate on the inside of Nancy Guthrie's front entrance. According to News Nation, that gate is constructed in a way that makes it nearly impossible to force open from the outside. It is designed to stop exactly the kind of breach that would allow someone to remove a person from the home against their will. And yet, Nancy is gone. Some law enforcement officials familiar with the investigation, speaking to News Nation, have raised a theory that follows directly from that detail. If the exterior gate cannot be forced from outside, then getting Nancy out through the front of the home may have required someone already on the inside to open it. Not a stranger who forced entry, someone who was already there, someone who knew the house, someone who knew that gate. This is an active theory being examined by investigators. It has not been confirmed. No one has been identified or accused in connection with it. But it reframes the question this investigation is trying to answer. Because if there was someone inside that home, someone Nancy may have known, someone who understood her routines, her layout, her security, then the masked figure on the doorbell camera was not acting alone. And the circle of people who could have provided that access is not infinite. If you are watching this for the first time and want to follow every development as this case moves forward, subscribe to Crime Doc Network now. This is an active investigation. Things are moving. We will be here when they do. There is one more layer beneath this one, and it begins not on February 1st. It begins 3 weeks earlier on a date that the FBI has asked about, that Nancy's own family flagged publicly, and that no authority has explained. The FBI went back to the neighborhood. That is the detail most coverage moved past too quickly. Weeks into the investigation, long after the initial canvass, long after the doorbell footage had been released and analyzed and discussed across every major platform, federal agents returned to the Catalina Foothills on foot, door to door, asking questions they had not asked the first time or asking them differently. According to News Nation investigative reporter Brian Enton, who has reported from the ground in Tucson throughout this case, agents specifically asked residents about former neighbors who moved out of the area shortly before Nancy disappeared. They asked about a house under construction nearby. They requested the names of contractors and construction workers who had been active at that site in the weeks leading up to February 1st. Those are not the questions you ask when you are running out of leads. Those are the questions you ask when something in the existing evidence pointed you back to a specific time window, and you need to fill in who was present during it. What that time window is, and what the evidence showed that sent investigators back there, has not been disclosed. Carlos Palazuelos was the first person publicly associated with the investigation after the doorbell footage was released. He identified himself to reporters as a delivery driver living in Rio Rico, a community in southern Arizona, roughly 60 miles south of Tucson and close to the Mexican border. He was detained during a traffic stop on the night of February 10th, the same night the FBI made the footage public. Law enforcement told him he resembled the person seen on the camera. His home was searched under a court-authorized warrant. The FBI's evidence response team assisted Pima County deputies with that search. Palazuelos told reporters outside his home the following day that he wanted to clear his name. He said agents damaged his front and back doors during the search. He confirmed the warrant. He said he was a delivery driver and could not remember whether he had ever made a delivery to Nancy's address. He was released without charges. A second person was detained around February 13th, removed from a residence approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home. Roads in that area were closed to the public for about 4 hours. That person was taken in for questioning and released the following day. Their identity was never publicly confirmed. Nanos said at the time that if detectives were not satisfied, the person would not have been released. 2 detentions, 2 releases, no charges, no publicly named suspect. The backpack has been one of the most actively pursued physical leads in the case. The FBI confirmed it is a 25-liter Ozark Trail Hiker pack, a model sold exclusively through Walmart. Nanos noted publicly that while the backpack is a Walmart product, it could have been acquired through secondary markets, including eBay. Investigators have not confirmed whether any purchase records have been identified. The firearm and holster have received less public attention, but they may carry more investigative weight. Nanos said during a press briefing that the holster had some pretty unique characteristics. He declined to elaborate. FBI agents visited multiple gun shops across the Tucson area in the weeks following the footage release. CNN spoke to several shop owners. Most declined to say what agents asked them. One owner told CNN that an FBI agent visited and showed him photographs of various individuals. He did not recognize any of them. Another owner told local affiliate KOLD that an agent asked him to review between 18 and 24 images and names associated with potential firearm purchases, and that a search of the shop's records found no matches. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer, speaking to News Nation, said the suspect in the footage is, in her assessment, highly identifiable. She cited specific physical features: his eyebrows, his mustache, the way he carries himself, and a pinky ring visible in the footage. She described the ring as a detail that narrows the field considerably. If that is accurate, if this person is as identifiable as a former federal agent with decades of experience believes, then the question of why 54 days have passed without a publicly named suspect becomes harder to set aside. There is one more investigative thread that has not received the attention it warrants. Neighbors in the Catalina foothills reported to News Nation that their internet service experienced an unusual disruption on the night of February 1st. At least one resident said his Ring camera's recorded history from that night is simply not available. FBI agents canvassed the neighborhood asking specifically about that disruption, whether others had experienced similar outages, and when. The timing aligns with the window in which Nancy disappeared. In the footage from her doorbell camera, an object is visible extending from the suspect's pocket. The shape and dimensions of that object, according to sources who spoke to News Nation, prompted investigators to examine whether it could be a signal jamming device, a piece of technology capable of disrupting local Wi-Fi networks and preventing cameras from recording or uploading footage in real time. This has not been confirmed. Law enforcement has not publicly identified the object, but the FBI's specific questions to neighbors about the internet outage suggest the theory is being taken seriously. If the suspect came equipped with a device designed to knock out the neighborhood's camera network, and if the internet disruption that night was not a coincidence, then what was already a premeditated crime becomes something more calculated still. It means someone thought through not just how to get inside, but how to ensure that as little evidence as possible survived the attempt. Savannah Guthrie's family made a specific public appeal in early March. In a statement released to local Tucson station KVOA, they asked community members to search their memories around 2 specific time windows: the evening of January 31st and the early morning hours of February 1st, and also the evening of January 11th. January 11th. 3 weeks before Nancy disappeared, investigators had already been asking neighbors about that date for weeks before the family's statement. Authorities have not explained why. They have not said what happened on that date, what was observed, or what the evidence suggests occurred. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has not addressed it in any public briefing. That is not an oversight. When an ongoing investigation fixates on a specific date without explaining why, it is because that information is being withheld for a reason. The FBI returned to Nancy's neighborhood in early March and asked residents about that same date. They asked about a vacant property in the area. They asked about construction activity. According to sources who spoke to Yahoo News, federal investigators returned specifically to ask fresh questions about both of those things: the vacant property, and the construction in the same time frame that January 11th was surfacing as a point of focus. None of this has been explained publicly, which means one of the few solid conclusions available from the investigative record is this. Something happened on January 11th that investigators believe is connected to what happened on February 1st. And that something involves people or activity in the physical space around Nancy's home. Crime Doc Network will cover every development in this case as it comes. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update. Because the next layer of this case, the one that puts pressure on everything else, is not about what the suspect did. It is about what the people responsible for finding him did instead. The no confidence vote was not a close call. 241 members of the Pima County Deputies Organization voted against Sheriff Chris Nanos. 65 abstained. Not one deputy voted to express confidence in his leadership. Not one. Bob Krieger served in the Pima County Sheriff's Department for nearly 3 decades. He told the New York Post that Nanos is not the best communicator under pressure, that he gets wrapped up in his thoughts, becomes emotional, and sometimes repeats himself without being challenged. He added that he would not put it past Nanos to get caught up in the semantics of his own statements. That assessment from a colleague of nearly 30 years landed in the middle of a pattern that had become difficult to ignore. On NBC Nightly News in March, Nanos told the anchor that investigators believe they know why Nancy's home was targeted, that the crime was deliberate, that the suspect chose that address specifically. He said the team had strong beliefs from day one, and that those beliefs had not diminished. Days later, on a local radio program with KVOI, a different version of that statement emerged. Nanos said that when he says he believes something occurred, that is his opinion only. He said the case would get investigators there eventually, that evidence would show the way. He said right now, everything is speculative, and there is nothing in front of the investigation that definitively identifies who did this or why. Those two statements are not compatible. The first is presented as investigative knowledge. The second withdraws it entirely. Both statements came from the same person, about the same case, within days of each other. Rick Castigar spent 37 years working alongside Nanos in the Pima County Sheriff's Department. In a March appearance on News Nation, he described Nanos as an egocentric individual and said he became strongly aware of that over time. He said Nanos is vindictive. He said the vanity was visible to residents almost immediately when Nanos stepped into the spotlight during the early days of the Guthrie case that Nanos was out, talking to anyone and everyone who would listen. Instead of coordinating with the FBI and ensuring that investigators were approaching the evidence with a unified strategy. These are allegations. Nanos has not been found responsible for any misconduct in connection with this case. He has defended his handling of the investigation and said he is conducting it as well as he can. But the institutional picture around him has continued to deteriorate. The Arizona Republic published an investigation revealing that Nanos had a history of disciplinary action during his time with the El Paso Police Department, multiple suspensions, and an incident that resulted in his resignation before he could be terminated. This history was not disclosed when Nanos was hired by Pima County decades ago. His publicly posted resume contained date discrepancies related to that period of employment. Pima County responded that the errors were administrative and not intended to mislead. Nanos dismissed the story when reached by the newspaper, calling it a hit piece and refusing to address the specific discrepancy. Pima County Supervisor Matt Hines said during a Board of Supervisors meeting that Nanos's 42 years of service appeared to be built on fraud. That characterization is contested. The process to potentially remove him from office is now formally underway. The union representing Pima County deputies has called for his immediate resignation. Sergeant Aaron Cross, head of the Pima County Deputies Organization, asked the Board of Supervisors to exercise every authority available to them. The April 7th hearing is now less than 2 weeks away, and the question the investigation needs answered most urgently is not about Nanos. It is about what happens to the case if the person leading it changes in the middle of an active search for a missing woman. Former FBI agent Coffindaffer told Newsweek that she believes there is a certain incongruency in what has gone on between the sheriff's office and federal authorities. She said the lack of trust in the progress of the investigation may have already prompted a shift. When she noted that the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Arizona had sent federal prosecutors to accompany FBI agents to Nancy's home in early March, she called it great news. She said there is no way prosecutors make a routine visit to a possible crime scene. Their presence means they are engaged, that they are looking toward potential federal charges and federal oversight of this case going forward. The U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona, Timothy Corchain, confirmed the visit and said his office would go anywhere, do anything, and persevere always to find her. That is not the language of an office playing a supporting role. If federal prosecutors are now embedded in this investigation, if the trajectory is toward federal charges and FBI primacy over the case, then the question of who leads the Pima County search operation may be about to matter less than it did 30 days ago. But none of that answers the question this investigation still cannot answer. Not even close. January 11th keeps coming back. It came back in the FBI's door-to-door canvass. It came back in the family's public statement. It came back when federal agents returned to the neighborhood weeks into the investigation and asked fresh questions about a vacant property and nearby construction. Every time investigators in this case have expanded their focus, that date has surfaced alongside the expansion. Here is what the record shows. Authorities began asking neighbors about January 11th, weeks before Nancy's family made their public appeal. That means the date was not generated by a tip from the community. It came from inside the investigation itself. Something in the evidence, physical, digital, or testimonial, pointed investigators backward 3 weeks from February 1st and landed on that date specifically. Nancy's family, in their statement to KVOA, asked the public to search their memories around January 11th, as well as the events of January 31st and the early morning hours of February 1st. They framed it as a key timeline. That framing did not come from nowhere. Families in active investigations coordinate closely with law enforcement before making public statements about specific dates. The inclusion of January 11th was not accidental. Now connect it to what we know about the suspect's behavior. The footage from Nancy's doorbell camera did not capture him on one occasion. A source familiar with the investigation told CNN that the masked person was recorded at Nancy's front door on at least one other night separate from the morning she disappeared. FBI Director Patel's social media post revealed that detail publicly before local investigators were prepared for it to be released. They had wanted to manage that disclosure. They did not get the chance. If the suspect came to Nancy's door on multiple occasions, scoping the entrance, studying the camera, learning the layout of the front of the property, then the question of when that surveillance began matters enormously. January 11th is 21 days before February 1st. 21 days is enough time to observe routines, to identify when a person is home and when she is not, to understand what vehicles pass through the neighborhood and at what hours, to locate access points, to determine what the security setup looks like from the outside and whether it presents a problem. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer told Newsweek the case remains what she called red hot, that the FBI is managing more investigative leads than most cases ever generate. She said agents, numbering up to 100 at various points, along with analysts and officers from multiple agencies, have been working every actionable lead. That is a significant deployment for a case with no publicly named suspect after 54 days, which raises the question that the evidence around January 11th, the multiple visits, and the internet disruption forces into focus. How much of what happened on February 1st was decided long before February 1st? Consider the internet outage again. Neighbors in the Catalina foothills reported the disruption to News Nation. At least one resident's Ring camera history from that night is simply missing. The footage is not available. FBI agents followed up specifically on that outage, asking multiple residents whether they experienced the same thing and when it occurred. The object visible in the suspect's pocket in the doorbell footage prompted investigators, according to sources who spoke to News Nation, to examine whether it might be a signal jamming device, a Wi-Fi jammer, a piece of technology that does not require proximity to a single camera. It disrupts the wireless network that multiple cameras in an area rely on simultaneously. This has not been confirmed by law enforcement, but the FBI's specific and repeated questions about the neighborhood's internet service on that night suggest the theory is not being dismissed. If a jammer was used, the suspect did not come to Nancy's home hoping the cameras would fail. He came prepared to make them fail. That is a different kind of crime than the one that gets solved in the first 2 weeks. And then there is the door. The security gate on the interior of Nancy's entrance. The one that, according to News Nation, is constructed to resist forced entry from outside. The one that some law enforcement officials believe would have required assistance from someone already inside the home to allow Nancy to be removed through the front. Place that alongside the rest of what the record shows. A suspect who appears more than once before the abduction. A neighborhood internet outage timed to the disappearance. An interior gate that may have needed someone on the other side of it. A date 3 weeks prior that investigators have fixated on without explanation. Cryptocurrency ransom notes with deadlines that came and went. Former FBI Supervisory Special Agent Harry Trombitis told Yahoo News that the ransom scenario is appearing less and less likely as a true motive. His reasoning: there are too many ways to get caught when ransom is the goal. Too much contact required. Too much exposure. If the ransom notes were not the actual motive, or if they were designed to mislead, then what this investigation is actually looking for is not a kidnapper who got greedy. It is something more considered, something that took weeks to plan, something that required knowledge of Nancy specifically, of her home specifically, and possibly of the people around her. Nanos told NBC News in March that investigators believe they know why this home was targeted. He would not say why. He said from day one the team had strong beliefs, and those beliefs had not diminished. If that is true, if investigators believe they understand the motive and believe the crime was targeted, then the suspect is not a stranger who happened upon an elderly woman living alone in an affluent neighborhood. The suspect is someone with a reason specific to Nancy Guthrie, or to her family, or to something connected to both. That is the deepest layer this investigation has exposed so far. And it is still a layer with a question underneath it. If you have been following this case and you want to be here when this investigation moves, subscribe to Crime Doc Network and turn on notifications. We are not going anywhere. Neither is this case. 54 days. Here is exactly where things stand. The Joint Task Force is now the primary operational structure for this investigation. According to Brian Enton of News Nation, 4 detectives and a sergeant from the Pima County Sheriff's Department have been relocated to the FBI's Tucson office. They are working out of that building full-time, dedicated solely to Nancy's case. The task force structure represents a formalization of the FBI's role, moving from assistance to shared command on a day-to-day basis. The FBI's investigative command post has shifted from Tucson to Phoenix. The Bureau confirmed to CNN that all agents working on the ground with the Sheriff's Department are staying in place. The move is administrative, not a drawdown of resources. DNA analysis remains ongoing. Investigators are now exploring forensic genetic genealogy as a tool, a technique that uses partial DNA profiles to identify biological relatives of an unknown contributor and work backward toward identification. It is the same method that ultimately identified Brian Kohberger as the suspect in the University of Idaho murders in 2022. Lance Lysing, a retired FBI supervisory special agent, told CBS News that the process takes time. He said there is no shortcut through it. The tip line is still active. After an initial surge of nearly 18,000 calls in the first weeks, volume has decreased. The FBI told Fox News reporter Matt Finn in early March that tips have tapered. The Bureau continued to urge anyone with information to call. Investigators have stated that tips already received continue to be processed and followed up on, meaning the investigation is still drawing on leads generated weeks ago. The FBI has also continued active canvassing in the neighborhood. Agents returned to the Catalina foothills in early March, asking about former residents, about construction activity, about the vacant property adjacent to Nancy's street. That kind of return visit, weeks after the initial canvass, reflects a specific investigative focus rather than a general sweep. Federal prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Arizona accompanied FBI agents to Nancy's home in late February. Timothy Corchain, the U.S. attorney, confirmed the visit publicly. He said his office would persevere to find her. Former FBI agent Coffin Daffer said, "There is no way that visit is routine, that the presence of federal prosecutors at a possible crime scene means charges are being contemplated at the federal level." What that would mean practically: the FBI moves from supporting role to primary investigative authority. Federal charges carry different jurisdictional reach and different prosecutorial resources than state-level charges. It would represent a formal shift in command over a case that has been marked by friction between local and federal agencies from very early on. The April 7th hearing before the Pima County Board of Supervisors is now the most immediate institutional variable in this investigation. The board has directed its legal counsel to draft language requiring Nanos to submit a sworn report on his conduct. If he does not comply, the board has the authority under Arizona law to remove him from office and appoint a replacement. Nanos has said he will comply with the request. What happens to the case if that leadership changes is not a question that has been answered. The FBI task force structure insulates the day-to-day investigation from that disruption to some extent. But the Pima County Sheriff's Department remains the lead local agency. A change at the top of that department, in the middle of an active search, is not operationally neutral. Two questions remain that this investigation has not answered and may not answer soon. The first is January 11th. Whatever drew investigators to that date, whatever the evidence shows happened in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood 3 weeks before Nancy disappeared, has not been disclosed. Until it is, the full shape of what was planned and by whom and how far in advance cannot be known. The second is the DNA. Nanos has acknowledged mixed samples at the lab. Investigators have turned to forensic genetic genealogy. The timeline for results has not been given. That evidence, if it yields a usable profile, could be the thing that changes everything. It has not yielded one yet. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 54 days. She needs daily medication. She was 84 years old when she was taken from her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona, in the early hours of February 1st. Her family said it plainly in a statement released in March. "We cannot grieve. We can only ache and wonder." That is where this case stands today. Not closed, not cold. Active, complicated, and unresolved, with the woman at the center of it still not found. The suspect may have come prepared to blind an entire neighborhood's camera network before he ever touched Nancy's front door. If that is accurate, if a signal jamming device was used that night, then the security system you have at home right now may not be enough on its own. Here's what this case specifically points to. A camera that relies entirely on Wi-Fi to record. An upload is vulnerable to exactly the kind of disruption investigators are examining in Tucson. If the wireless signal goes down, the footage does not save. Local backup storage, a camera that writes directly to a card or a hard drive inside the home, independent of any network connection, removes that vulnerability. Cellular-based cameras, which route through mobile networks rather than home Wi-Fi, are harder to jam with consumer-grade equipment. Neither solution is expensive. Both would have changed what investigators had access to on February 2nd. The interior security gate at Nancy's home is another detail this case surfaces for anyone thinking about their own safety or the safety of someone they love who lives alone. A lock on the inside of a door, a secondary physical barrier that requires manual. Release from within is a different category of protection than a standard exterior lock. It addresses a specific scenario. Someone gaining access to the outside of a door does not automatically gain access to what is behind it. Nancy's routine also matters here. A scheduled virtual check-in with a friend was the reason her disappearance was reported at noon on February 1st. That check-in created a hard deadline, a moment when someone outside the home would know immediately that something was wrong. For older adults living alone, that kind of structured daily contact is not just companionship. It is a detection mechanism. It is what set the investigation in motion within hours rather than days. What this case teaches us about how investigations like this one actually function is something Crime Doc Network returns to across every case we cover. Jurisdiction matters. When a local agency and a federal agency share responsibility for a case, the question of who controls the evidence, who controls the communications, and who controls the investigative direction is not automatically resolved by goodwill. It is resolved by structure, or it is not resolved at all, and the friction becomes visible. In the Nancy Guthrie case, that friction became visible very quickly. What it cost the investigation in time and momentum is a question that will only be answerable once this case reaches its conclusion. We will be here when it does. 54 days ago, an 84-year-old woman was taken from her home in the middle of the night. The question this video has been asking is not who took her. Investigators are working on that. The question is whether the decisions made in the rooms where this investigation has been managed have affected how close we are to an answer. That question has not been resolved. It may not be resolved until April 7th when the Board of Supervisors meets and decides what happens to the man currently leading the search. It may not be resolved until the DNA lab in Florida produces a result. It may not be resolved until someone in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood remembers what they saw on January 11th and makes the call they have not yet made. Crime Doc Network will cover every development as it comes. The April 7th hearing, any movement on the DNA analysis, any new information about the task force and what federal involvement now means for this case. Subscribe and turn on notifications. When something breaks, you will hear it here first. If you have any information, anything at all about Nancy Guthrie, about the events of January 31st or February 1st, or about anything unusual you observed in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood in the weeks before she disappeared, call the FBI directly at 1-800-CALL-FBI. If you were near that neighborhood on January 11th, check your footage. That date is still open. That date still matters. One question remains at the center of all of this. Investigators believe they know why that house was targeted. They have said so. They have chosen not to say it publicly. Somewhere in this case, there is a reason, a specific reason. A reason that points to a specific person or a group of people who knew enough about Nancy Guthrie to plan this, to return to her door more than once, and to come prepared for the cameras. It is day 54. Nancy Guthrie has not been found, and somewhere, someone knows exactly why.